just saw a wonderful panel discussion about unlocking wealth from a corporate ownership structure.
I think it was a great event. We had an opportunity for a lot of business owners that don't get to speak to colleagues that deal with the same problems that they deal with behind the curtain at their companies.
I think that it's important to provide good education for the business owner, entrepreneur, CEO community from professionals who have done it and who have worked with owners who face the same issues that those owners are facing every day.
Welcome. I'm Jonathan Penta, founder of Penta Wealth Management, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening for our special event focused on unlocking your company's value and successful business transition planning. We really have just a fantastic program lined up for you here this evening with an amazing panel of experts. Each of the panelists you'll hear from this evening are truly leaders in their areas of practice with proven track records helping owners in transition. I'm just honored to join them on the panel this evening, and I want to thank each of them for being part of our event this evening. Before we jump into our panel discussion, I'd just like to share a quick story about a client of ours that I think really illustrates why we're here this evening and how careful planning can really lead to a highly successful business transition. So let me tell you about my client who's currently retired, former CEO of a technology company. A little over 4 years ago, this client started doing some serious thinking about selling his company, but at the time, didn't really know what the company was even worth or what it would need to sell for to meet his long-term financial goals. At the same time, he also didn't know if he should sell at that time or if he should wait and hopefully grow the business to be worth more down the road. Now, when we did a comprehensive business valuation actually came back less than what the owner thought the company might have been worth. Pretty common for business owners. At the same time, we did an analysis of all my clients' financial goals, including gifting to children, charitable inclinations, spending in retirement, buying a vacation home. And when we modeled all of those goals into our planning system and assessed the impact, really the impact of selling his company at that valuation on his ability to meet those goals, we identified that there was a wealth gap. So my client is then faced with this decision really to either reduce his financial goals and aspirations or take steps toward increasing the value of the business. Now, since we were able to identify some key value drivers that could be improved upon, my client decided to take steps toward growing the business. And over the next 3 years, we implemented some value enhancement strategies where we were able to actually increase the value of the company by over 30%. And about a year ago, he sold that business for just north of $60 million. Now, not only is he happy with the price he was able to sell the business for, but more important, he was able to meet all of his financial goals for him and his family, including setting up a charitable foundation, buying that vacation home, gifting to his children through tax shelter gifting strategies, and is now living really a dream retirement. Now, having a highly successful outcome like that is achievable, but really only possible through careful planning and by aligning a business owner's personal, financial, and long-term goals. In other words, how do we get all of that blended and aligned so that an owner can have a significant exit, but be happy on the other end? So I'm obviously very passionate about working with business owners. That's why we're hosting this event. And given my passion, I actually went out and got certified in this very thing many years ago and became a certified exit planning advisor. And I'm certified in a methodology known as the value acceleration methodology. My role within that methodology is really to help the owner plan from a wealth management and financial planning standpoint, to help them think about the financial, business, and personal elements of their life and business, getting all of that blended and aligned to have this significant exit where the owner is able to, 1, sell for maximum value, 2, achieve all their financial goals, and 3, be ready and prepared and to embrace their next stage in life. Research shows that a business owner is 5 times more likely to be ready to sell their business when they have a thorough understanding of how that future sale impacts their financial plan. So a lot of what you'll be hearing about tonight is owner readiness, planning early, and the importance of having an expert team of advisors to help you along the way. And a big part of what I often do is put that right team of advisors in place and quarterback the planning effort along the way. So with that, we'll get our panel discussion underway. By the way, in your packets, there's a QR code that will navigate you to our event resources page, where you'll find helpful articles and white papers about other business owners that have built significant companies that sold for high value that were happy on the other end. So you can take those with you. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Tom Sherwin. Tom is the founder and president of CEO Resources Incorporated and is a nationally recognized expert on CEO coaching, strategy, succession, and corporate governance. Among the 350 plus companies Tom has worked with include public companies, private companies owned by families, individuals, and institutions of higher education. So many business owners and CEOs have reached their professional and personal goals with Tom's help. He really knows businesses inside and out, and we're lucky to have him here with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Sherwin.
From my far left, Greg Rush is co-founder of Dunn Rush & Company, a boutique investment banking firm specializing in middle market mergers and acquisition advisory. Mr. Rush has deep transaction experience across a range of industries, including manufacturing, distribution, business services, technology, consumer, industrial, media, and defense. Prior to Dunn Rush, he served as a managing director for Citi Capital Strategies, a Citigroup middle market investment platform. Prior firms include Tucker Anthony Incorporated, SunTrust Robinson Humphrey. In addition to decades of experience in investment banking, Mr. Rush spent 6 years as chief operating officer of Community Newspaper Company, a cluster of 100 newspapers and specialty publications in Boston, prior to turning it over for a sale to Gatehouse Media. Next to Greg Staller is a master lecturer in strategy and innovation at Boston University Questrom School of Business. He's actively involved in building entrepreneurship, experimental learning, and international business programs at Boston University. He also actively mentors student teams that participate in business plan and venture capital competition. He's the owner of a commercial real estate holding company and speaks and reads not less than 7 languages. There's a goal for you in the future. He holds a BS from Cornell and an MBA from Harvard Business School and is currently a doctoral candidate. His research interests are in business strategy, innovation, business planning, international entrepreneurship, and global strategy. Janice O'Reilly is a partner in the consulting division of AAF CPA, an advisor and former leader of the outsourced accounting and fractional CFO practice, which provides right-sized outsourced accounting solutions for cloud-based bookkeeping to CFO deliverables designed to optimize effectiveness of the modern finance function. Public, privately held, and nonprofit organizations value the pragmatic assessment, infrastructure setup, and flawless execution of their accounting and finance deliverables, all completed with the resources and technical expertise of AAF CPA's full-service CPA and consulting firm. Next to Janice is Shannon Zolo. Shannon advises clients on a wide range of corporate law matters, including mergers and acquisitions, private equity, venture capital, executive compensation, and corporate governance. Shannon has significant expertise in the life sciences, healthcare, technology, and defense sectors. He also serves as outside general counsel to a number of privately held companies. Active in numerous professional and civic organizations, Shannon is the co-founder of XPX and a member of the board of trustees of Cristo Rey Boston High School, where he chairs a development committee. And he also speaks Portuguese, which, as a number of my recent clients have that background, he's a very valuable asset. And that brings us to Mr. Penta. And Jonathan Penta is the founder and CEO of Penta Wealth Management, leading the firm's comprehensive wealth management services. Jonathan's professional experience included 7 years as a senior VP at Morgan Stanley and 12 years as a senior VP at USB Financial. With 23 years of experience in financial services, Jonathan provides expert guidance to a select group of high net worth individuals, families, and business owners, helping them navigate the complexities of wealth management. Jonathan is a leader in financial planning, investment strategy, business exit planning. He specializes in building customized investment strategies centered around the client's financial plan goals and objectives. As a certified exit planner, Jonathan also helps business owners and CEOs plan for successful exit, maximum business value, integrated business planning, and with personal financial goals. Jonathan's understanding of both the personal and business financial planning from an early career professionals to business owners preparing to exit makes him a highly sought after for comprehensive wealth management services. With that, I'll begin with Greg Rush. And Greg, what are the trends and market conditions in the middle market M&A?
Thanks, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay?
Very well.
All right. Well, I think this is a question people ask all the time when we get together and with different groups. And we've been lucky because in the last couple of weeks, some of the data has come out on the second quarter and first half of the year. We tend to measure health of the market on two things. We consider middle market to be transactions valued below $250 million. And we look at the health of the market based on the number of transactions that happen and the data we can pull on how valuations in general for companies in that category across a whole range of industries are moving. Data for valuations is a little more sparse than the number of deals that happen, which is partly why that's kind of the easiest thing to get our arms around. And I think we've been through a period of about 4 to 6 quarters that were particularly slow and off considerably from the quarters that were all-time highs in 2021 and the first half of 2022. But I think the interesting new information we've gotten is that I think that's starting to turn a little bit. Through the first half of the year, we're off about 5 to 10% in the number of deals that happened last year, which were off 10 to 15% from the year prior to that. But Q2 is looking to be about flat with Q2 from 23. And another way that we look at that, because the pandemic and all of this has kind of messed up how many different banks and investors and buyers think about companies. What people are starting to do now is say, as things normalize a little bit, how do the companies look today in their performance, their growth trajectory, and so forth, relative to what they looked like before the pandemic? So looking back, comparing the performance to 2019. And, I think if you look at it, Q1 was right about flat to the performance that we saw in 2019, which at that point in time was right around, bumping against the ceiling of all-time highs. And Q2 looks to be between that level and where we saw a high in the middle of 2022. So I think that's a good sign for things to turn around. We did see, and one of the things I think is driving this, in the last 18 months, there's been sort of far fewer transactions being done by private equity firms. I think they had been running rampant for 6 to 8 quarters, and they've been focused on integrating a lot of those acquisitions. Higher interest rates made it a little tougher to get deals done, and they pushed values down a little bit too, so they weren't selling. But we saw that volume increase by about 30% in Q2 over a year ago, Q2, in terms of private equity activity, which I think is a good sign. The banking market is still quite tricky. High rates make it expensive to borrow for leverage lending, but a lot of the banks just simply are a little overcautious and not lending into the M&A markets. That's also contributed to the slow time. But I think we're seeing leverage multiples and the correlated valuation multiples come back a little bit in the most recent quarter. We saw valuation multiples tick up about a half a turn, despite rates still being quite high relative to the last few years. We also saw some interesting things, seller financing and earnouts, which had crept up over the last couple of years, even to some of the larger transactions. Historically, transactions under $25 million have always had a significant percentage of contingent performance in their deals, up to roughly 50%. But what we'd seen in the last 4 to 6 quarters was even deals at $50 million were well over, we were over 50% having some element of contingency, and even the deals between 50 and 250 were up approaching 50%. Those bigger categories have started to trend back down to where the historical norms are. So, I think we saw deals that were in between 25 and 50 back to about 36% had some form of seller financing and earnouts, and deals over 50 million or between 50 and 250 were back down under 30%. So normally those are going to come down a little bit more to get to historical norms. But, all of the other associated data points, levels of escrows, holdbacks, all those types of things are also starting to revert back to more seller favorable terms. So we're expecting combination of that and some of the things I'm sure you'll hear about a little more tonight, changes and that are coming in the estate planning world. I think we expect to see Q4 and 2025 to be a much busier time.
The other Greg, tell me about not to get political this evening, but do you think that this election will have any effect on what Greg just told us about in terms of the middle market?
Absolutely. Good evening, everybody, by the way. Thank you so much for coming. I think right now that the world is skittish. And I think the world is skittish for three different reasons. One is so much is hinging on our election. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, we have clearly moved to partisan politics. And regardless of whether Trump or Harris gets in, I don't necessarily think the market is going to move one way or another. I'm more concerned with the fact that regardless of whether Trump or Harris gets in, that you probably are going to have a deadlocked Congress. Wall Street likes deadlock. They don't like one party being completely in control, but still we have to deal with, the tweets and everything that comes out of it. So that's point number one. Point number two is that so much of our economy, if you will, in the States is interlocked with China. China has gone through a major upheaval from 1989 when, everyone is familiar with Kaifeng, which is the reform and opening in the late 80s going into the early 90s. Then, of course, China flooded the market with cheap goods. Between 1989 and today, Chinese labor costs have gone up by 46%. You are now seeing a major trend that we saw in the 60s and 70s called inshoring, where U.S. companies are bringing labor and manufacturing back to the United States. Apple bought Apple with their M2, their M3 chips, etc. Third point is that we are all hopelessly interlocked. So the U.S. dollar is strong, strong, strong. That's great for us in the United States. It's really bad for the rest of the economy. So when you talk about middle market firms, and I agree with Greg Rush's assessment of something be 200 million and below, you literally have economic gridlock. Nobody wants to do anything until the election is over. Nobody can do anything because China is having geopolitical issues with the States. China's currency is not what it used to be. China's export market is not what it used to be. U.S. firms are trying to keep up. But although the Dow and the NASDAQ hit and the S&P hit new highs today, you are having companies shed their labor forces left and right. So that's the reason why Greg indicated that deal flow is down. Nobody knows what to do. And when all of these people are out of work, and unfortunately it's going to keep happening until we get through the election, that's going to cause the M&A market, the private equity market, and the VC market to come to a screeching halt.
Anticipated my next question.
Can I disagree? I agree generally with what's been said here in terms of how we're characterizing 20, 21, 22, and the shift that is occurring now. I think it's going to be sector dependent where the activity is occurring. So for example, in life sciences, there's a lot of activity and it has been going on now for the last, in my experience, the last 4 to 6 quarters. There's been a lot of M&A activity, a lot of investment activity, private equity activity. But life sciences, I think, is a function of two things. One, the demographic and by the way, when I say life sciences, I mean healthcare too. That's part of it. The demographic shift that's going on in society, the aging of the society, is driving a lot of demand and a lot of opportunities. And then the second aspect of this is the private equity money that's out there. One of the risks I think we run as experts here is that, we're throwing these terms around and I'm sort of looking out the audience and I'm like, yeah, they didn't understand that term. They didn't understand that term. So if you don't understand some of this stuff, either during or at the end, raise your hand and let's get some clarifications. But private equity is this catalyst that's affecting everything that both Gregs have talked about and what I'm talking about. And I'm going to give you a 30-second tutorial. And if you understand this at your next cocktail party, you can drop these lines and you're going to be the smartest person at that party. Venture capital, early stage, a lot of risk. Typically the product or service is in development. It's not commercialized. The investors that bet on that, the venture capitalists, are betting big. They have a $100 million fund. They invest $3 to $5 million early stage in these companies. They do 20 investments in the fund. They only need 1, 2, or 3 of those to pay off. And what does that mean? They're looking for 10, 15, 20x returns on the one investment.
So they bet $5 million on one of 20 companies. If they can hit a 20x return, there's $100 million, there's your fund, okay? But that means 17, 18, 19 of those investments could go all the way to zero. That's venture capital. That's not driving M&A activity. That's not driving what we're talking about. Private equity is more mature investing. The concept of a fund is still applicable. They raise money, they go invest it, but they're investing in more mature companies or very mature companies that have P&Ls, balance sheets, and they have deemed those companies as to be underperforming or inefficient or both, and by investing, they can take those companies from where they are to a better place. But those guys or people are typically only looking for 3 to 5x on those investments over 3 to 5 years, not 10, 15, 20x. So if they raise a $100 million fund and make the same number of investments, they're getting a lot of singles and doubles, and they hope for an occasional home run. Those funds are under time pressure to invest. If they don't invest, typically it's a 10-year period. The first 5 years, they need to deploy the capital. The second 5 years, they need to recoup the capital. Otherwise, under their governance documents, the GP, the general partner, loses the ability to charge a fee for the money that it's managing. And so that's a long-winded way of explaining some of the catalytic effect that private equity has on the market. Healthcare is in demand. You have the pandemic, there was sort of a pause, but now you have private equity who have not made investments maybe for certain periods of time, and they're feeling tremendous pressure to deploy the capital, make investments. And so that's what's causing some of the activity to occur in certain verticals. Now, I agree with what Greg's saying. There's the political risks and geopolitical stuff, and all of that does come to bear on market making activity. And we don't know yet how things are all going to turn out and how the markets will react. But underneath all of that, what I'm talking about is going on every day. And so there are some lawyers and accountants in the room. We see it. It's happening in a meaningful way, and has been, in my experience, for the last 12 to 18 months.
Do I get a rebuttal?
Yeah. Sorry.
I think that Shannon is correct with one minor amendment, which is that private equity is going to make its money by mitigating costs, by reducing costs. The number one cost in most companies is labor. And if they are hitting their numbers for their LPs, their limited partners, the people who invest in these funds, and everybody keeps getting laid off, which is exactly what's happening right now for the past 3 to 6 months, that's what concerns me. Because my bread and butter is small to medium-sized business. I consult, I teach this stuff. I've been teaching this stuff for 25 years. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that. And when the small to medium-sized businesses start feeling the crunch, because people are going to give up a gym membership, people are going to give up discretionary income, that's what worries me. So on one side of the balance sheet, Shannon's absolutely right. M&A activity, private equity, the Q3, Q4 looks really, really robust. For the average person out there, small to medium-sized business, that's what keeps me up at night, knowing that if you get laid off right now and you're in your late 50s, early 60s, you have to figure out a new plan of attack.
So what about the outside of the United States or the same kinds of size companies, Canada, Europe, Japan? Are they? Yep, please.
I think you need to bifurcate the world into 4 different buckets. You've got the Middle East, you've got Europe, you've got Asia Pacific, you've got Latin America, and that's outside of the United States. Every single one of those regions is having issues right now. Asia Pacific, the juggernaut in Asia Pacific used to be China. Now, because China is feeling its own weight, you have Vietnam, you've got South Korea, you've got Japan, who are jockeying to basically usurp all of the market share that China's lost. So that's what's happening in that region of the world. Obviously, Europe is going through same inflationary pressures as we get here in the States. They are, to an extent, dealing with the European Central Bank. They haven't quite figured out what's going on with that, because Germany is potentially dealing with layoffs for the first time ever at some of its automotive companies. You've got France, which is in political gridlock because you don't know what's going to happen with Macron and his government. So Europe is somewhat stymied. The Middle East, we don't need to talk about the Middle East right now with what's going on in Israel and Lebanon and Palestine. Palestine, and unfortunately Latin America, there's no good news because of what's happening in Venezuela with Maduro. So I wish I could snap my fingers and tell you that after November, everything's going to revert to normal. I am bullish on 2025, but I think it's going to be in baby steps. And what Shannon was saying, which I vehemently agree with, is that private equity companies make their marks 3-5 times at a time, through 3-5x at a time.
We call that violent agreement.
Exactly. But my point being that it's going to take Asia, it's going to take Europe, it's going to take Latin America and the Middle East by literally doing 1 and 2 times returns to get its footing, and that's probably not going to happen until early 2026 at the earliest.
We introduced the sword of Damocles with these economic changes, Jonathan. I thought I would ask you, what percentage of businesses fail because of unintended consequences, and what are the 5 most common reasons that happens?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So, according to the Exit Planning Institute, 50% of businesses fail because of unintended consequences, not being prepared, and that is being prepared for the 5 Ds, typically, which is death, disability, divorce, distress, or disagreement. So having a proper contingency plan in place and working with a really good M&A corporate attorney like Shannon to have those operating agreements in place, to have the necessary systems in place and operating agreements in writing, having your buy-sell agreements in order, having your key person insurance in order to de-risk. So a lot of what we talk about on this to be prepared for one of the 5 Ds is de-risking your business and going through each of the steps needed to be prepared for any unforeseen events like that.
So, Janice, what are some of the accounting pitfalls, issues you have seen in deals that may upset the best laid plans?
Well, I'm going to start back from looking at your business model. And one of the things that we typically do when we go into a company early on is look at what they're doing from a revenue perspective. Do you have recurring revenue? Do you have elements in there that you think would get you the highest valuation when you do try to sell at some point? So we really try to start early and look at the business model. There are ways to take what you're doing and turn it into something that, as an example, could be a recurring revenue piece. As you start going forward, it's really important that you stay in compliance. For example, when we do deals, we are talking about, holdbacks and some escrow, particularly for areas of non-compliance, like in state and local tax, which we call SALT. That's a big area that's looked at. When you go through a transaction, you're going to have to look at making sure you can get a certificate of good standing, that everything's in place. What you don't want to have happen is start to go through a deal and start to go through diligence and slow down and have some momentum stoppages because you're not prepared. From an accounting perspective in particular, most of the companies that I deal with are small to medium-sized businesses who have never gone through a deal before, including their CEOs and their CFOs. So we really look at, for example, a company might be coming in to price you, and they'll be looking at a multiple of revenue, or they're looking at a multiple of EBITDA. And you are not on the same basis that they are. So, for example, you could be on a tax accounting basis or cash or accrual, and they might be coming in on GAAP. If any of these terms don't mean anything to you, let me know. But we find a lot of people don't really understand what those differences are. And it's really important, particularly if you're dealing with a buyer that's coming in and pricing on a basis that's different than what you're looking at. So those are the things that we typically look at.
What kind of strategies or changes can a CEO implement to maximize value in that setting?
Going back to one of the first things I mentioned is looking at your revenue model. Almost every deal that we've done, unless it's a straight IP deal, is looking at revenue and EBITDA. So you really want to figure out how to get that recurring revenue model up and think about your business model. I'll give you an example. We had someone that you had a membership to something, and as you used it, your membership points went down. There was no recurring revenue. There was no way to really track what your recurring revenue is. You could look at maybe customers who renewed, but you didn't really have a good model and the valuation was low. When we turned it into, yes, there's an annual membership, and with the annual membership, you get certain benefits. You could now start tracking your membership on an annual basis. You could look at your recurring revenue, your net customer turn. You could start looking at some metrics that would boost your valuation. The other thing that we like to look at is a lot of CEOs try to anticipate what they think will be a value. So they start thinking, should I go into growth mode? Should I do an acquisition? Am I growing enough organically? Should I do something inorganically? And almost always, it's better to make sure that whatever you're doing well and doing it profitably. So we say before you start expanding and going into either sometimes new industries or even buying a competitor, really understand what you're doing and make sure you're doing it well and profitably.
So, Shannon, what becomes very clear to sellers after a deal closes versus when it starts? What did they wish they knew more before the deal started?
Everything. Look, I try to put myself in clients' headspace or minds when I'm talking and giving advice and perspective on these types of issues. So I'm trying to do that as I sit here with the audience, half of whom I might know. If I were a business owner right now and I were considering the next 3 to 5 years and there were some type of exit in my mind that I wanted to achieve, the very first thing that you need to do is you need to build out a team of advisors. Sounds self-serving because we're sitting up here as a panel of advisors, but that's the number one thing that, in my experience, after a deal closes, business owners will look back either gratefully or with some misgiving if they didn't assemble a proper team of advisors, accountants, lawyers, investment bankers, special consultants, etc. The second thing that I oftentimes see and that I try to advise against, entering a negotiation with the objective of getting every single penny of value, maximizing value, and not leaving anything on the table. I think that's an erroneous perspective as a business owner going into a process. And there are a lot of reasons why. A couple of the highest occurring reasons are, one, you don't know what kind of buyer is going to purchase you, whether it's a corporate buyer, a competitor, or a private equity-backed buyer. Huge distinction in how those types of buyers view you as a target seller. And being flexible about what the quote-unquote enterprise value or purchase price is for your company will vary dramatically between those two choices. If you're doing a private equity deal, oftentimes a significant component of that deal is what they call rollover equity. You sell 75 or 80% of your equity up front to the buyer, but you roll 20 to 25% into the new entity that survives the deal, effectively the buyer. And that equity is part of that new company going forward. That private equity buyer typically will want you to at least be part of a transition, if not be part of the team that tries to take that company to the next level 2 or 3. And then you sell it 3 to 5 years down the road, and your rollover equity is part of that second sale. That can be a very lucrative scenario. I've had clients where the rollover equity ends up being worth more than what they received for the 75 to 80% up front, depending on how things progress. So within that context, what the purchase price is on day one for that company that you're selling to the private equity buyer, it's not that it's irrelevant, but it's not nearly as important, because the rollover equity piece could end up making the difference in how you view your personal financial success. So that's just one example, but it suggests that you need to have flexibility about how you perceive your company going into that process. A quality team of advisors will know this based on experience and will be giving you, anecdotal data points so that you can understand that logic. The last thing I would say And again, these are all interrelated, but I've had very successful business people that run very successful companies who are very, very unintelligent when it comes to deal making, because it's not what you do. I would never be so audacious to say I could go into your business, and because I'm a smart guy who's done some really impressive things for a number of decades, I know how to run your business. It's so absurd to even think it. I would not even want to say it. You would be shocked the number of people like yourselves that tell people like us how we need to be approaching our practice as it relates to your deal. It just doesn't make any sense. It's completely counterintuitive, but it happens. You don't know as much as you think about deals, and even if you do have some deal experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the expert on your deal to get the best outcome. So there's a level of humility that you need to have going into a sale process. Again, if you have the right team of advisors who are okay speaking to power, i.e. you, the client, you're going to be fine. If you're hiring a bunch of yes people, you're going to end up hurting yourself in the end and do yourself a disservice.
Shannon, not to drag this out with you, but when we were talking previously, one of the things you mentioned in this regard was don't respond to unsolicited offers. And you didn't mention it there. I thought maybe we'd insert it now.
That's a great point, Tom. Where'd you come up with that idea? It's awesome.
From you.
Yeah. No, that all kidding aside, and Greg can speak to this. The number of times in my career where a client has come to me and said, so-and-so offered me X to sell my company. I want to do that deal. The very first thing I'll say to them is, that's great. We're not going with them right now. What do you mean? This is a great number. He said it's going to be a simple deal. We're going to get it done in 30 days. I mean, the warning signs from that conversation are a biblical proportion, okay? The bottom line is, if you're serious about selling a business and coming up with the best deal that serves your objectives in the end, like Jonathan alluded to, you hire a market maker, an investment banker, who understands your industry, understands the players, both public and private, both corporate and private equity backed, who are in that industry, knows how to analyze your business, do a market analysis, and figure out where you fit in that industry, and then can go to market on your behalf and create what we call an auction process, where you have multiple bidders bidding for your business. And I'm not going to steal Greg's thunder here as the investment banker, but the high level takeaway is you don't know where your buyer's going to come from, and you don't know what they're willing to pay. And there's a whole bunch of reasons that that could be the case. So if you get an unsolicited offer or multiple, that's an indication that people think you have a valuable business, but they're trying to buy it on the cheap before you involve an investment banker. And that's obviously not a smart move.
Greg Rush is a member of Dunn Rush. They are an M&A firm. They are the market maker that Shannon just talked about. That's the business season to keep us straight in this panel, who does what. But since I have Greg Rush on my microphone, I collected a question from somebody was, why should I do this preparation? What does it all mean? How impactful would all this really be? Give us your perspective, sort of keying off of what Shannon just told us.
Yeah, it's, there's so many of the points Shannon made that I'm sitting here waiting for my opportunity to speak so I don't jump in and say, yes, that's correct. And the other question, Tom, that I know we talked about coming in was sort of how far in advance should people all be doing these things? And that's like the easiest question anybody could ask all night, because the answer, no matter how much you've done and where you are, is always you should have started yesterday. You can never do too much preparation. You've never heard anybody close a deal and be happy with it and say, boy, I wish I'd done less preparation. You never will hear anybody say that. Far more likely that, every person I talked to was like, oh yeah, our finance department's awesome. We're great. We're totally prepared. We got this, we got that. But at closing dinners, we ask people, okay, if you highlighted this too, Tom, if you knew then what you now know, what would you do differently? And they laugh. They'll say, my God, well, first of all, thank God we just did this. This is awesome. I'm excited. All the things I can do now. But if I'd known what I know now, I'm not sure I would have had the guts to do it. It is honestly far and away the most brutal thing. If you haven't sold a business before, stressful, anxiety, time. I mean, the points about unsolicited offers, all these things, the reason you need to do this preparation with people who do it, eat, sleep, breathe it 10 times a day is every buyer, whether they're a corporate buyer, whether they're a private equity buyer, whether they're a competitor, honestly, if you start doing something with a family member to try and transition it to them, they're going to have advisors that are going to do this the right way. These are smart people. You're not going to slip anything by them. You can't beat the market. You can't time the market. The reason you get paid a multiple is because people are looking for the future cash flows of what you're doing, and their best approximation of that is what you've done in the past. If you try to carve all the meat off the bone, these buyers are smart. They do this for a living. They buy companies low, they sell companies high. They prefer to do them both. You know, I think if you have somebody that can push them to pay a fair value up front, they need to see the continuing upside or they won't pay you a high multiple. So timing the market, just forget about it. You need to prepare and be able to communicate the right value proposition to the right buyers, and it's different. You might have 6 different value propositions to different buckets of buyers. And, you know, unless you can get them to compete against one another and compete against themselves, because they don't know whether they're the high bidder when you run through this type of we don't use the word auction, by the way, because I think people get a little anxious when they hear that, but we call it we've got a brand of, we call it done rush, 2-stage controlled sale. Sounds a little nicer, a little gentler. The reality is it is no less gentle, but yeah.
That's what I was looking for. And so, Greg, you had a comment.
So I would absolutely agree with what Shannon and Greg Rush said, with one exception, which is rollover equity, the auction, or whatever you call it with your soundbite, is a U.S. construct. If your buyer is from outside the United States, it is a completely different process. In many cases, you only could respond to an unsolicited offer. It's just that's the way it works. In France, for example, the rollover equity construct doesn't really exist. It's just not as respected. So if you're selling something from the United States to a U.S. buyer, everything my co-panelists have said is absolutely correct. If you are dealing with somebody from outside the United States, the time frame is longer, the approach is longer, and there's no such thing as the consulting agreement for 2 years. You literally are going to be involved with that buyer for probably a minimum of 5 to 7 years in the future.
France is a different animal, but they compete on all the deals, by the way. So international is it's not that different. You do need to go earlier to the Far East with language challenges and things, but Europe will bid just like Georgia or California.
Yeah, but not Asia.
So it's not Asia.
About preparing the company, what about preparing the individual, Jonathan? You talked to me about something you call owner readiness. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my introduction, owner readiness is really preparing very early for a business owner. We look at it as aligning the 3 legs of the stool, which is aligning their business goals with their personal goals, with their life after the business goals. Life after the business meaning the owner having an understanding and a thought process already in place well in advance of the sale of their next act, what their next stage of life might look like. Actually, a lot of deals end up falling apart at the 11th hour for that reason, where the owner gets cold feet because they haven't actually thought that through and they're not really sure what they're going to do. So that's really important, falling under owner readiness. But when you align your personal goals with what your business would have to sell for, you can then start preparing early. And the example I gave with the client who the valuation came back less than what the client thought the company was worth, and actually wasn't going to be enough. There was this wealth gap, and we identify that wealth gap and then can take steps toward increasing value to where it would need to sell for to meet that client's goals.
Very well done. So back to Greg for just one, Rush, for just one moment. Are you seeing more PE buyers in the market at this point?
Certainly more than there were over the last sort of 4 to 6 quarters. But, you know, to kind of Shannon's point, I mean, the interesting thing about all this is every quarter there's a new record of dry powder that's available. As the public markets have become smaller and smaller in terms of the number of companies that are there, pensions funds and endowments, they're all making bigger investments in private equity and venture capital, by the way. They diversify in all these things. But more and more money flows into these things. And kind of to the point, when inflation is high and businesses are struggling, cutting is the only way they can increase profitability. But they also have to get that money put to work. And I think there is a lot of pressure and increasing supply and demand for private equity to get rolling. And I think we're starting to see that just literally in the Q2 numbers with them re-entering the market with some more transactions, because they've been pretty quiet relative to corporate acquirers for the last year and a half.
Just one last question for Greg Stoller. How can I attract angel investment in my company to create a national franchise?
I think that you need to be willing to look at taking on a partner. And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it an advisor. You can call it whatever. But when you're talking about someone buying even 1% of your company, they are now your partner, for better or for worse. If you want to go into a national franchise model, you have to be willing to give up some control. And I think that a lot of people treat it as my baby. And they say, well, I'm going to have somebody a partner, but they're really going to be a silent partner. Like we don't really have to talk to them about everything, but they'll be a partner when it's convenient. It's not. It's like it's a business marriage. And if you are willing to go the national franchise route, you won't know every single one of your customers anymore. You won't know every single one of your employees anymore. And you have to make a decision as to whether the growth and the development of your business is going to outpace what got your business to this point. And I will close by telling you this. It is a completely amazing set of skills to get from 0 to 5 million in revenue. That's a really impressive amount of things to do. It's a completely different set of skills to go from 5 million to 10 million in revenue. Right.
With that per comment.
The question was interesting because it asked about an angel investor coming in to do a national franchise. And one of the investor types that Shannon didn't address is an angel investor, which is typically an accredited investor. It's an individual. I'm an angel investor. I'm part of an angel group. Looking at something like national, trying to do a franchise isn't typically something that an angel group, those types of angels, would be interested in. So I think that part of the question was very interesting. I think I would go back and say, what does your projection look like? Maybe there's a more traditional type of financing that might be interested in funding some sort of franchise rollout. An angel investor is going to come in even earlier than a venture capital. They're typically, very early, even maybe alpha stage, right? They're definitely pre-Series A. So I'm not sure that I would look to an angel or an angel group to do that growth phase.
Picking up on the conversation we were having about preparation for the company and preparation for individuals. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you, I think the question I have here is, what are the most critical pre-liquidity event planning items that an owner should be thinking about from a personal financial planning and wealth management standpoint, and how far in advance of a sale should an owner begin thinking about these items?
Yeah, well, so in terms of when, as Greg Rush was saying, we always say yesterday, but rule of thumb, really on average it's 12 to 18 months, if not 24 months in advance. In fact, the client example I gave earlier, that process started 4 years ago. So it's never too early to start, but that is a good rule of thumb, 18 months, 24 months. In terms of the areas that you want to start to think about, it's everything from tax planning to estate planning, insurance planning, business succession planning is very important, as I talked about earlier, with de-risking the business and just making sure that you have a proper contingency plan in place well in advance. God forbid anything should happen between when you start planning and when a deal is about to happen. Retirement planning, thinking about your spending need and your goals for post-sale. We actually start thinking about how to allocate the proceeds from an investment allocation standpoint. That process actually starts well in advance of receiving the proceeds. The last thing an owner would want to, start figuring out is when they get the proceeds, how should I start investing this? Ideally, you already have a plan in place for exactly when that money comes in, how you're bucketing those proceeds. You might have gifting strategies in place to shelter some tax from the deal. That should be planned for in advance. A lot of owners want to know, when I sell a company, how can I shelter as much tax as possible? And so thinking about that early, and if there's gifting strategies that you're thinking about, if there's estate tax planning strategies to shelter tax from the proceeds, all of that very, very important. And then, of course, your deal structure as you get closer to the transaction, as you're working with your investment banker and your corporate attorney, you're already starting to think about what structure, how much is cash versus stock, how much are you getting up front versus later. So all of that, very, very important.
So we're going to change the theme for a moment, and now we're going to move on to talking about the transaction itself. And as a business advisor, CEO's friend for 30 years, I can tell you that some of the things you've heard about how difficult it is for an executive running a successful business to suddenly feel like this ambition to exit the company turns into a very challenging period for that person, because it's totally out of the sync with what they have become so expert and always being in charge of. And we've talked about this team of experts that suddenly appears from where they come from. And I know myself, I've been oftentimes the situation is that the CPA is a transaction CPA. The lawyers that set transaction lawyer. These are not your people you've been working with all these years of building your business. You know, they have expertise in sustaining your business. These transaction experts, they're about that exit process. So I'm going to ask Shannon a series of questions that are specifically around the transaction, because the lawyer becomes the lead in the field expert when it comes to the actual transaction itself. And I won't be surprised if the other members of the panel have comments that they would like to make from their perspective as well. So, Shannon, my first one is, what are some of the typical problematic issues that will arise during an M&A transition for a seller?
So I'll try to keep this brief, but again, it's high level. If I'm selling a business and buyers with their advisor teams are coming in looking at that business, they're going to give you an LOI that lays out the letter of intent, that lays out the basic terms of the deal, and that's phase one. And then you're going to get into the purchase agreement, which effectively memorializes the overall transaction. I've grossly oversimplified it, but those are sort of the two phases. You're never going to get a higher price after the LOI is signed. Buyers are looking for holes in your business, weaknesses in your business. This is the question that Tom's alluded to. What are the things as a seller that you should be concerned with that could adversely affect your deal? Can't list them all here. But high level, the things that will come up on almost every deal that are quote unquote problematic and lead to some type of negotiation and risk allocation discussion, classification of employees, independent contractors versus W-2s. That's a hot button issue that always comes up. If you have intellectual property in your business, have you adequately protected it so that the business owns it and the intellectual property doesn't reside in you as the owner of the business or your employee workforce? Environmental. Do you operate a business that has discharge? Are you operating your business on a site that previously was operated by somebody that has discharge? These are just three simple examples that will be a part of every deal. And you, as a seller, need to do effectively a pre-deal examination of your company. If you want to understand what the weaknesses are of your business, try to sell it and go through that examination. If you've got a team of advisors, they can walk you through that process and you can preemptively address some of those issues, but you can't wait to react to those issues in response to a buyer.
I can add in a bit too. Shannon and I have worked on a few deals together. I think the other thing I want to talk about is when he talks about the letter of intent, the LOI, is going to be the deal structure is in there. And it's going to talk about whether this is an asset deal, whether it's a stock deal, whether there'll be working capital adjustments, whether there'll be earnouts. They'll have a potential price in there, but you don't necessarily know how those components are going to shake out. And it's really important to think about that from the perspective of what kind of entity do you have. And this is where a good tax advisor or someone can come in and tax lawyers. Because, for example, if you have a pass-through entity, if you're an LLC or an LLP, you might actually have zero basis in that company. And so everything that you potentially sell, depending upon how the deal is structured, could be taxable. So it's really important to talk to someone, depending upon the type of entity that you have, what they're looking at. Is there a way to do something that isn't going to be as taxable? Is there a stock-for-stock component? Is there something else that's in there? So it's really important from the get-go, even in the LOI negotiations, that you're dealing with advisors.
Just to add one thing, Tom, if I can, to Janice and Shannon's point. Shannon made the point, the LOI, your price is never going to go up from there. An offer in general, an LOI, or a number of people that say they have an offer, we wish I had a nickel, right, for every person that thinks they have that. But oftentimes it's what gets them thinking about these things, because it's not unimportant. Getting an offer is easy. Closing an offer is near impossible. And I think no letter of intent you've ever seen is worth anything at all to you unless you are convinced it can get closed. And 100% of that confidence level comes from your level of preparation, not what you think is necessary, but what these buyers are going to have their armies of. You're going to have 30 advisors from the buyer that are in your data room scrubbing over thousands of documents, each one of them looking to rationalize their six-figure fee. And they do that by suggesting the price should be carved back or changed or done in a certain way that is going to bring down your proceeds. You need to have advisors that are going toe-to-toe with these big advisors that the buyer comes at, and the LOI needs to be something. If you pick an LOI and you're not sure it can get closed, it's worthless to you. So you have to run through all this stuff and make sure that when someone gives you the LOI, you've shared with them the good, the bad, the ugly about your business. Hopefully you've had a chance to talk to your advisors and get to fix anything that's bad or ugly or fixable, put insurance around things like environmental issues or whatever it is, because they're going to find it, and it's going to blow up your deal if it's big enough to change the terms by enough.
For example, is sometimes the buyer thinks they know your business, but they really don't. I'll give you a recent example of a very large financial institution coming in to buy a smaller entity. And we were on a due diligence call. They had 24 people on their side of the call, and we had 3. However, we knew this client's business very well, and they were coming in to try to set aside a significant portion in escrow for the sales and local tax for SALT. And they thought they understood the business. And what we knew was we were able to go in, we knew their business model, we knew what was and wasn't subject to SALT, and we were able to get that from an $8 million escrow down to zero. And so keep in mind that just because they say something doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And if you have your advisors who know what they're asking, what you know they're perceiving the risk to be, you can help to mitigate that. So that was a really good example of really working with people that know your business and know transactions.
In fact, this panel of experts, group of advisors, I think maybe Jonathan mentioned it, they're trained and they have the personalities to be able to talk about it. And you may not be as accustomed to being talked to by anyone as they will be criticizing, finding weaknesses in your business, bringing up these things. And oftentimes you've been faced with those topics before, maybe by a board or somebody else, but this time they're not going to let you off the hook. And they're going to keep pressing you to show you where this weakness is, and they're doing it for a reason. You're paying them to help you get the deal done, and this is a flaw. Shannon actually gave me a list of things that they're most likely to be looking at. I'm just going to ask him to reel off this list, and it doesn't necessarily need a long dissertation because you're going to identify many of these topics are parts of your business. One of these topics is your Achilles heel. Listen carefully.
Well, I'm impressed that I remembered. I had 3 out of the 5 that I listed. So I've already talked about intellectual property, employee classification, environmental, taxes, whether it's a sales use tax, historical tax payments, whether you've been properly structured so that you're paying the appropriate taxes. The big one I'm about to mention, a lot of business owners don't fully appreciate until the deal hits them, and that's third-party contractual consents, and whether contracts that generate revenue for your business are actually assignable within the context of a deal. I can't tell you the number of clients that don't want to pay legal fees because they're not selling their company, and they're like, oh, I negotiated the contract, it's all set, no problem. And then they get to the sale 10 years later and they have 13 contracts that are unassignable. That's a big problem if you're a seller. And you've just cost yourself way more in legal fees to solve that problem than it would have cost to fix it up front. So the language of these contracts has to effectively provide for your ability to have those contracts go to a buyer. Two other things I want to list that are on the list that I wanted to mention. Indemnification. That's a real legal word that everyone acts like they know what it means, but they don't really. Indemnification, if you're a seller, means you stand behind what you're selling and you promise to make a buyer whole for any statements, representations, or warranties you made about your business that subsequently proved to be inaccurate or untrue. You've got to make the buyer whole through the indemnification process. That's really important because that can be divided into various categories: fundamental indemnifications, general, etc. The last thing that's on this list, if this is the only thing that you take away from tonight, it will be something that you can actually quantify in terms of the value. RWI, rep and warranty insurance. Give me a minute. In the old days, before RWI existed, a buyer would come in and negotiate the deal, and as part of the deal, it was a given that somewhere between 10 to 15% of the purchase price was going to be set aside in an escrow to stand behind your indemnification obligations for somewhere between 12 and 24 months. So if you sold your business for $100 million, $15 million is going to sit in escrow for 18 months until that passage of time occurs and no problems have occurred from the buyer's perspective. So effectively, 15% of the deal is subject to risk for some period of negotiated time. RWI is an insurance product that has come onto the scene over the last 10 plus years, where an insurance company, a third party, will issue an insurance policy as it relates to your deal. They'll stand behind the reps and warranties that you make as a seller to the buyer, such that after it closes, if something were to occur, it's the insurance policy, for the most part, that will cover the damages to the buyer. That's in and of itself gives you peace of mind as the seller after the deal closes, that you don't have to worry about them coming back after you. But the second piece of this that is absolutely huge, instead of having to leave 10 to 15% of the purchase price in escrow, you leave 0.5% per the terms of the insurance policy. So 14 to 14.5% of the purchase price comes to you on day one and is no longer subject to risk. When you're selling your company, you should be highly encouraged by your advisors, and you should be insisting from your investment banker that RWI is part of your deal. Okay?
Keep in mind, also be doing diligence. The insurance company's doing diligence. So you still want to make sure you're in good shape.
It doesn't let you off the hook.
Yeah.
You go through the process as you normally would, but at the end of the day, you're maximizing the amount of cash that goes into your pocket on day one at the closing that's no longer subject to risk. Most deals have to be an enterprise value of at least 25 to 30 million to have an RWI policy in place.
The other thing that I think is really important to mention, and this is really difficult for the seller, is that you have to depersonalize yourself in the transaction. And that's why Greg Rush is so accurate that, 5 years before you need to do it. The reason I say that is the person buying you is going to treat it as any other deal. So when you go and get your dry cleaning, you don't think of the emotional connection between in dry cleaning, you didn't pick up your clothes. So you pay your money and you get your clothes, right? If you If you go to the bank and you need take money out of the bank, or you set up, I don't know, a CD, you don't think about the emotional stability of the teller. You say, I'm here, I got to get back to work, etc. The buyer is going to treat it as any other transaction. You are selling your life's work. And everything that made your business, 95% of it, the buyer's not going to care about, as long as the representation, the warranties are accurate, that the business is worth as much as you say. It's so easy to say and so difficult to do. And all I'm saying is, if you role play, if you do a mock closing, it will just save you from a lot of angst, because once you get that check, the buyer never wants to talk to you again.
One last thing on all of this. The buyer wants you tied up for at least a year or two, so make sure I can pick your brain and Jim. But one point that's important, when you run this process and you've done all this work with your advisors ahead of time, all of these points Shannon and Janice just made about whether it's SALT, whether it's what's going on with environmental and how people are going to treat, are they going to use rep and warranty insurance? We would go to them as part of the bidding process. And you compete, not just price, you're competing terms. And you will have buyers that are unwilling to do rep and warranty insurance. I've seen companies and clients of ours pick a slightly lower bid because they were willing to do rep and warranty insurance and get an extra, in this case, double digits of millions of dollars at closing in their pocket, because the other party wouldn't do it and wanted to do a traditional 10% escrow. So you compete it out. And when you get that LOI, anything that could possibly be important to you, you want to have in that bid letter. You want a punch list. Every buyer is going to respond on the 19th at 5 p.m. to these 10 or 12 things that are important to you. How are you dealing with employees? How are you dealing with real estate? How long does the owner stay on? Are you going to use rep and warranty insurance? All that stuff has to be thought out, prepared for, and put in front of these people. So when you compare offers, you're apples to apples and you can line them up.
And you can't put it in after the fact.
Oh, no.
You'd say, oh, by the way, I forgot.
You're not going to get anything more, as Shannon pointed out, with the LOI. You don't want to negotiate the full purchase agreement, the LOI. You got to walk that fine line. But I'd also say, if someone starts pushing back on the terms you agreed to and you view unfairly and not something other bidders would have done, you kick them to the curb and you go back to bidder number 2, another benefit of the process. I mean, I've had to do that a few times, and 3 of the 4 times that's happened, we've ended up with better terms, not just with what the second bidder bid the first time, but better than where the first bidder was. A lot of that has to do with the company's ongoing performance. It always goes better when your performance is up and to the right. But the process has so many benefits.
I think there's a couple of real nuggets there, and in this business phase of the transaction itself. And like you've been hearing them say, you can't take it personally. And you say to me, I've just spent 30 years of my life taking it really personally. I mean, this is my baby. This is my life. I sacrificed time away from my family. I did all these things to build this business, and my professionals are preparing me for the fact the buyer, frankly, doesn't care. The buyer has a value formula that matches their business. It doesn't rely on what was in your business, a lot of which is, your heart and soul that you put into it. So it is a opportunity for you to have this relationship with these people who you never knew before, transaction people, because they were never doing a transact. And then all of a sudden you have this relationship with them, and it can go on for months at a very high intensity, and the intensity gets higher and higher as time goes by. And what happens after the closing? This panel of people, you may never see them again because they're transaction people. And you just did a transaction, and they helped you, and you were successful. They're successful because their job, our job, is to help you be successful all the way through the life of your business, including the transaction. So, Shannon, another question. What's the difference between a strategic buyer and a financial sponsor PE-backed acquirer?
So if you remember at the beginning, we talked about the private equity fund, the venture fund. Those are professional investors that go out and raise money as a general partner from limited partners to create the fund. And then they deploy that capital in the form of either investments or acquisitions. That's a PE buyer. Sometimes they're referred to as a financial sponsor. The takeaway is that they are professional investors, professional acquirers, deal people. Contrast that with a corporate buyer, which is typically someone that's in the same industry as the target. They can be direct competitors. They can be tangentially related to you as a company, but they tend to be in it for the long haul as an entity. They typically have strong balance sheets, and they have a long-term horizon. So within that context of those two examples, a PE buyer will buy your company, and because they're a professional investor, they have an internal clock that says we need to do what we need to do with this company over the next 3 to 5 years, and then we need to flip it because we as the general partner have a fiduciary obligation to our LPs to distribute the proceeds of their investment from what we did with this company. So they are hyper-focused at the margins on valuation, on the terms, on things that you as a seller might not fully understand what's driving their behavior. Corporate buyers, and these aren't universally applicable, but they're general principles. A corporate buyer can have a much longer time frame as to how long they have to turn your company into what they want to turn it into. And so you may have more flexibility in terms of how you structure that deal relative to a PE deal. There are pros and cons to both, and it's not one size fits all, but your investment banker will identify the bidders that fall into the private equity bucket versus those that fall into the corporate strategic bucket.
A really important thing to point out here. So strategic or corporate buyers are typically going to have a lot of things called synergies, like cost savings, and it's really important to getting the best price. Valuation is only ever about two things: cash flow and risks to those cash flows, period. It might not be your operating cash flow. It might be the cash flow from selling it to somebody else down the road. But that's, if you want to receive cash, the buyer's going to pay cash. They're eventually going to want cash. And, I think synergies and savings, they don't care what your cash flow is. It's what their cash flow they're going to make on it would be. A strategic buyer that has those things could be looking at your cash flow that's $2 or $4 million, whatever it is. It could be double that to them when they take out 2 facilities that they don't need or a duplicative management team. And they don't want to share that with you, by the way. You have to get them to compete and to get as much of it that they're willing to share. A PE firm that does not have what's called a platform already there doesn't have any of those things. They need the building, they need the people. So by definition, and because they pay based on the leverage multiple they can get from a bank, they just can't bid as much as a strategic buyer. The holy grail of all this is, and I would tell you 95% of the buyers that have won the processes since we set up our firm more than 15 years ago are a hybrid of the two. They're a corporate company that's already owned by a private equity firm, usually a bigger one that would be interested to buy you as a platform, and they're going to tuck you in with the savings and synergies, and they have that clock on their head weighing on them to do more deals and eventually turn that money back to their investors. If you can get one of those things, that's great. You'll get a better price than somebody that doesn't have either. If you can get them both, they'll outbid the people that don't have them 95% of the time.
However, there is another interesting trend since I spent half of my professional life in academia. Most people, and I'm looking around the room, guessing most people here are over 35 years old, not everybody, but most. People who are under 35 years old have a slightly different approach. They might want to incorporate as a B Corp, which means that they are interested in social impact. They might want to have an ongoing relationship with you as the buyer of your business. It's not necessarily to maximize profit. So just keep that in mind, that there might be some people in this room that if you go for a corporate buyer or you go to a PE buyer, you might be able to sell the business for $100 and you might walk away with $100 in your pocket. There is a new type of buyer that might offer you $80 and want you to be involved with that business for the next 5 years as an advisor.
I think it's also important. I know that oftentimes clients ask, well, I don't know who all my strategic buyers are. And an investment banker like Greg is really good at looking at that. Like, might think about, a business that might need the same type of workforce that you have, or a business that might be in a related industry, but they would roll you in because you have a similar customer base. But someone like Greg is really good at identifying those. So you're not going to your investment banker and saying, these are my strategics. You might know some, but
it's not a mystery, to be honest. I mean, if we sell companies that are valued between 20 and 250 million, the audience of people that have the money and the wherewithal and the desire to do those acquisitions don't hide. In fact, they are desperately calling on people like us every time they're in town. They want to make sure they're seeing every deal we do. It's actually quite easy to put the audience of buyers together. The trick is making them, really chase things and bid against one another and against themselves. So putting the list together is actually pretty straightforward.
For you,
For me, we've got databases. So you're right.
automobile business, not so easy.
It's never the buyer ultimately that the people think it is. The people that are chasing you and calling you constantly, guarantee you they're doing that because they want to get a low price. And when you put them in the competition, sometimes they'll compete, but they won't be the high price. People are amazed because of this whole impact of synergies and savings. It's not like anything else you've done. You buy or sell a spoon at Walmart, it's this. At Target, it's a little more, a little less. If you have the kind of business that can drive 10, 15 bids in a process, the top bids will 100% of the time be double the bottom bids. It's literally a spread like that. And if you can run a competitive process and you don't, not every company can, but if you can run a competitive process and you don't, you will likely leave millions of dollars on the table.
So Shannon, one more for you was, what does a PE recap mean, and how should my understanding of it is a form of a deal structure impact as a seller would see in a potential exit?
PE recap is just a fancy name for a form of deal structure that the private equity folks like to consummate with sellers. And it includes the purchase price and then the rollover equity that I mentioned earlier. The combination of that is effectively called a PE recap or recapitalization. They're recapitalizing your company, giving you cash up front, having you roll equity. They come in as the majority owner of the new co. You stay on as a minority owner of new co. Couple of important points to remember as a seller as it relates to a PE recap. There are majority recaps where the buyer takes a majority position. There are minority recaps where they might take a minority position. The vast majority of the deals, they'll come in and take a majority. The second thing as a seller that you should be keenly focused on is the treatment of your rollover equity relative to the buyer's equity. Another fancy term you can use at the next cocktail party, pari passu, equal. You want your equity to effectively be on the same terms and conditions as the buyer's equity. You don't want it to be junior. You don't want it to have less rights and preferences. You want it to be pari passu. And to Greg's point, when you're negotiating multiple LOIs with multiple private equity firms, some will agree to that, some won't. And that can impact your decision as to which firm you go with. Even if there's a delta in the purchase price, if you're rolling over a significant portion of equity and it's pari passu, that could be more valuable even if you get less cash up front than if you were to take more cash up front, roll your equity, but have it be junior to the buyer's equity. The last point, why that's important, because when that company is eventually sold, if you're not pari passu or equal, depending on what the business sells for down the road, that you may not take in as much capital with that second bite at the apple if you're not equal with the private equity buyer.
Other thing to consider is whether you are going to be taking stock in the new company that's purchasing you or not. A lot of people want a cash deal for obvious reasons. I know one person in the room who shall remain nameless, whose family member sold their company, wanted to get cash. They ended up getting stock instead. That stock is now 100,000% more valuable than the cash they would have received 30 years ago. So that's just, obviously that's a unique circumstance, but you want to consider that as well, because Shannon's right. The rollover equity makes a big difference.
Janice has another form of transaction that I think is important.
We've talked here about equity type of transactions. I had mentioned before when we're talking about LOIs, there's also an asset purchase. And I don't know if everyone knows the difference between those two major types of acquisition. So you have an asset purchase or you have a stock purchase. An asset purchase is somebody's coming in and buying just parts of your company. Typically, they're buying maybe not the cash, maybe not the debt, but other types of assets that are there, and they're taking those over. Typically, they're the revenue generating type assets. That deal is set up very differently from a stock deal. And in the first situation, your company still stays as a legal entity, and you've got to unwind it, and there's all sorts of compliance issues that you need to do, tax returns and all that to unwind it. And that's a very different distinction from an equity deal, where a company is going to come in and buy 100% of your company, or, a percentage, but let's say it's 100%, and they're taking on everything, including your liabilities, potential liabilities, undisclosed liabilities. So the escrows for that, the reps and warranties, anything along those lines is going to be much different because they're accepting potential liabilities that may not even be known yet. So there are two very important distinctions. In that case, you don't have the existing company. You do have the existing company, but it's bought by another entity. And you can do different things with that. You can do a stock for stock. You can do cash for stock. But it's really important to understand the nuances between those two different types of purchases before you agree on any final pricing or anything else in the LOI.
And this qualifies as one of those things, so don't try to do this at home. You have an expert.
That is an absolutely critical point.
Yeah.
What I would say is we would work with Janice and with Shannon to understand, what are the things that you want to dictate to buyers? I would say most our deals have ended up being stock deals. Sellers want to sell stock, buyers want to buy assets. And so you can structure an asset deal to end up in the same place, but you want to dictate that our client expects to sell the stock in the company. If you're going to propose something different, you're going to have to make them whole for typically a tax consequence when they want to do that. And sometimes it's, when my family's business went through this, we dictated that to our banker to what people were going to be doing. And the people that bid didn't want to do a stock deal. And we were saying, well, that's what we're going to do, because we were a C Corp. And a C Corp in an asset deal, they buy the assets out of the corp, they get taxed there. Then when you take what's left and you try to send it to the shareholders, it gets taxed again. So that's why C Corps almost have to do a stock deal. But in this case, the buyer said, we'll pay you this if you make us do a stock deal, and we'll pay you this if you let us do an asset deal. And they made it they could run the math too. They're good at that. But they knew that it was going to be a little bit more compelling for us to do the asset deal, and we decided to do that. So critical stuff.
So now, after all of that, we get to the fun part. It's called the party. The party is you have a closing, and now there's millions. And so on to the rest of your life. And so here we have our expert about planning for the rest of your life. Jonathan, when would a business owner start planning for how they should actually be investing their sale proceeds, and what are the most important investment planning considerations they should be thinking about in terms of an overall investment strategy for the sale of the proceeds?
Thank you. So we talked about pre-liquidity event planning at a high level, which is the big picture wealth planning items, tax planning, estate planning, protecting your business, de-risking. When it gets into your specific investment allocation, we actually start planning that process very early in advance of the sale. And some of the considerations are how much of your portfolio you might need to be drawing from to meet your spending need if, in fact, you're retiring after the sale. Very important, which determines how we allocate your portfolio to produce that amount of income. So if your spending need is $15,000 a month, as an example, we want to structure the portfolio properly to meet that spending need. Another big consideration for many individuals when they're receiving proceeds from the sale of a business is gifting out of their estate. So we start setting up the appropriate accounts in place if it's in the name of a trust or grants to their children, whatever that their goals are from a gifting standpoint. We start planning that well in advance, working with the attorneys to make sure that we have the proper accounts in place, and then allocating those proceeds accordingly. Another important consideration is big purchases. So if you have a short-term goal after the sale, a lump sum purchase, we want to park that into a separate account and have that allocated accordingly. So really, it is well in advance time frame, at least a year. We should be having that conversation around exactly how to allocate the proceeds. So many different considerations that are important.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being our guest this evening. I'm going to turn the dais back over to Jonathan. Thank you for your participation.
I think what we'd like to do now is open it up to a Q&A, and everybody feel free to ask questions. We're here to answer.
Question is, sale of the Celtics is not a big secret that's out there. They're going through that process. And if we were advising them, what are some of the important things to think about there? The first thing I'd say is, a professional sports team is a bit of a different animal than what we've all been talking about. Different than a widget stamper or, something that's a consulting business or engineering practice and so forth. And I think the types of people that have the kind of wealth to do those, it's very much more of a hobby acquisition and prestige. And so it doesn't change the impact, though, of an auction process, because there's a lot of other people that have lots of ego and lots of prestige that they want that are going to chase those things. So I think they do work very hard to run a competitive process. They have to deal with a lot of other things, like the club nature of getting approval of owners that come in. Many of them aren't selling 100% stake. The ownership groups are going to have many, many constituencies usually, as opposed to one person that's coming in. So I think you just have to have all your ducks in a row and be able to vet the buyers in a way that's different than most processes. But you want to run the nuts and bolts of the process pretty much the same way. You want to make people put the best price and terms on the table for the best outcome for the constituents and the shareholders and stakeholders of the company.
So the only thing I would add to that, and this is not inconsistent with what we said at the beginning of all of this, the seller's objectives have to be identified before they go into the process. And the example I used earlier, I said, you need to be flexible in terms of how you sell your company, because if you're going to do a private equity recap, maybe the total purchase price up front isn't as important as to what you think ultimately it will be worth. That's just a personal objective. Where do you want to end up? What's your objective? And how do you align the deal structure through the process that Greg talked about to meet the objective? As it relates to the Celtics, if I were advising them, the very first question I would ask the selling shareholders, you have to figure out who's actually selling. I'd say, what's the most important objective here? Is it maximizing the price? Is it your legacy as the owner of the Celtics and the impact that you had on the community through your ownership, which is not insignificant? Is it who the next owner is going to be and what are their values and do they align? I just think it's a holistic conversation. And from what I've read, I don't think that they fully addressed that as a family before they entered the process.
The question is, how would you deal with a family that's selling their business? My pat response is all of the rules and everything that we've talked about that is order goes completely out the window. You would think that family businesses would try harder to avoid sexual harassment in the workforce. You'd think family businesses would try harder to avoid nepotism in their workforce. It is worse by a factor of 1,000% in a family business, because the joke that I say to my students all the time is, if you're the son or daughter and your father or mother happens to be the owner of the company and you have a bad day, who are you going to complain to? I mean, seriously. So you really have to think through equally about reps and warranties, rep and warranty insurance, having good advisors. Are you and your siblings going to be on speaking terms even after the check clears?
Okay. I think it's a very complex thing. I'll say one of the things that one of the managing directors who works with us that spent 40 years advising families and setting up their advisory boards, both fiduciary and just non-fiduciary, he used to make the comment that said, the job is really about separating the pathology of the family from the business. And it not in a funny way, right? Because I think a lot of times when multi-generational families come to us about should we sell the business, it's not usually a good reason that's kind of gotten there. And some of that's through lack of preparation, lack of communication. And you've usually reached a point where there's fighting. And the primary owners and the original family owners that founded the business would be horrified if they saw what the infighting between second, third, fourth generation that's now fragmented into cousins and uncles and everything else, some in the business, some not, fighting over what to do. And it's a good thing that this company has been built and has this value, but all the more reason the planning needs to be done ahead of time. You need to communicate. Oftentimes, people wrestle with how do you split up the value between family members when some are in the business and some aren't. And the easiest outcome is it's easier to split up cash, is how a lot of people think about that. But there's complications to that too, because the people that have dedicated their lives in the business are left without potentially something to continue on working forward versus those who are out. So very complex. The only thing I could tell you is get a different type of advisor, perhaps, in addition to the group that's here, that's literally going to be watching out for all of these pitfalls that Greg just mentioned, because they're very real, and make sure every person or every sort of stakeholder in the family business has a voice, is heard, and that when you do make a decision to do these things, it's been thought out all the way through. Super complex. You want to keep the family's integrity and happiness intact.
I know 3 different family businesses that have now signed charters indicating that they will no longer have family members be allowed to go into the business because it's expanded so large that how do you deal with a father who might have had 3 kids? Each of those kids might have had 3 kids. Now, if you keep saying you can go into the business, there's no way to keep chopping up all of the equity. So as a result, I know 3 different clients that have basically said, enough, you can no longer hire family members.
I'm going to add one more thing, and Jonathan had talked about it earlier about buy-sell agreements. One of the things we recommend is that you really do treat it like a business, and that's hard to do. It's almost when you talk about like loaning money to family and friends, and people sort of do it on the honor system and they feel awkward asking for a loan agreement or something. We really stress to professionalize it. Bring in lawyers, bring in family mediators, but have everything documented. Do a buy-sell agreement. Talk about our spouses, going to be involved. What's the next generation going to do? And really understand that and hash it out, because I've seen family members thinking they're on the same page, and then you start to document it and put it into an agreement and they're not. So my number one advice would be professionalize it as if you were doing business with other partners, which isn't easy to do with your family, but it tends to mitigate some of the issues.
So the question was, how do you deal with when the owner is so emotionally attached to the business, it's their baby, and how that can potentially lead to the deal not happening. The owner's not ready to sell. They're so attached to their business. So I touched on this earlier, but I'll expand upon it, which is, that there's this aspect of the sale, which is the owner's next stage in life and thinking about their next act, what comes after the sale. And so that's really important. And those conversations, we start early. We bring in coaches like Tom to have those deep conversations around those issues, planning for beyond the numbers. What do you want to do? What's your next act in life? Being ready for that. And usually those types of conversations get the owner to start thinking about, if there is that emotional attachment, this is all they've done for the last 30 years, plus in many cases, to thinking about what they want to do next, get excited about that, be ready for that, so that there's not this deal falling apart potentially at the 11th hour. Because a lot of deals do fall apart, even though they've gone all the way through the process, because the owner hasn't addressed that very thing. And the deal ends up falling apart, the owner gets cold feet, and it doesn't happen. And that, to your question, a lot of times is the reason.
We've seen, and Jack's one of my partners, where maybe the owner's ready to sell, the spouse isn't ready for the owner to sell. And we do see a lot of that happen. So you want to make sure that those meetings are held with all of the people involved.
Yeah, so it's really that alignment, that alignment of not only what do you want to sell the business for, and can you meet your goals, but that third aspect is aligning it with life after the sale.
I think the reality of that is these buyers are smart, right? No banker is trying to trick them into doing anything. They're not going to do anything that they don't want to do on their own. The quality of your company, the factors that a good banker can point out that have validity to them on the synergies and opportunities they have, you need someone looking out for your best interest, because I guarantee you none of those buyers want to pay as much as you want the relationship to be good. They don't want to pay you less, period. So I think, and there's a whole lot of things that go into whether your relationship after closing is going to be good or not, and none of it might have anything to do with the purchase price they paid for you. What you find out is the process you run is a process not only of presenting your company to buyers and putting your best foot forward and trying to see what offers they put forward and who values the things you've built the most, but it's you interviewing them and whether you think they're the best fit for you, whether their vision fits with your vision, which, by the way, they don't share with you the honest truth all the time, many times never. They have a plan for what they're going to do. And if you don't agree with that plan once you've turned over control, you're not going to be happy. But they won't tell you before the closing.
So I agree with that, but I understand where you're coming from as a seller, as a client of a banker. But there's also an alternative way to look at this. You want to hire a banker that actually has the relationships in the C-suites of the buyers so that they can pick up the phone and talk to the appropriate decision makers in those buyers. If there's a history between the banker and those buyers in various contexts, the fiduciary duty that the banker has in your deal is to you. But it's important that they know who the players are and that they have relationships. So if it were me, that's the balance you're looking for.
You do need to be careful with that, though, and you need to make sure you've matched up with a banker that does transactions the right size. Because, everybody wants to work, hey, Goldman sold my company. I guarantee you, if you're, a $200 million company, they're working for the buyers, period. Because they want underwriting business and M&A business from the $2 billion company, not the $200 million company. You're going to get all the stories you hear. You're going to get the analyst, the associate. You're not going to see the MD until the closing dinner. So I think you have to carefully match who you work with, to Shannon's point, with the people who have the best access to the people most likely to see the highest value and in what you want to achieve in your transaction. And it's not always the same one seller to the next, or even one seller within the company to the next. When you see, we talked earlier about some of the issues with an LOI, whether it's actually valid, whether you can get it closed. And now the question was, what are some of the red flags and important things you would see in there or not see in there that you'd try to make sure are in there or not in there? I don't think people issue LOIs with an intent to not deliver on it. I think the problem is if they don't have all the accurate information that realistically does impact the value of the company, it's going to change. Every buyer that comes in and finds out that, there's an environmental problem here, isn't just going to skate past that and pay you what was in the LOI. So it's much more about preparing and making sure you as a seller with your advisors are comfortable that you've disclosed. Disclosure is your friend in an M&A transaction. Shannon even talked about reps and warranties. Like, sellers are oftentimes like, well, I don't know if this guy's going to pay his bill. I don't want to say anything about that. I'm going to hope he pays his bill. But you, in a deal, you want to list that in your disclosure schedules, because if it's in the document that you signed and you close with, the buyer then can't come back to you under the indemnification and say, you didn't tell me this. You've already told them that. So the biggest issue is not so much that someone has the intent to try and, retrade their deal, is that they find something that is a very legitimate reason to retrade the deal. And you should have provided that information beforehand so that the bids you get incorporate all the bad things that you know of that they might find.
I'm going to talk a little bit just specifically about LOIs and some of the things that I see in LOIs. And I want to talk a little bit about the way the deal is going to be structured. So oftentimes a seller will look to the dollar amount. And it will say, let's make up numbers. It'll say the purchase price is $40 million or whatever it is. But then when you start looking down, you can see that, well, yes, but I need to assume my own debt, or a part of that is in an earnout, so it's contingent, it's not cash up front, or there's all sorts of other things that play into that. There's a target working capital number. Most of my clients don't even know what a target working capital is. And even just looking at things like earnouts, most of the deals will have something like that in there for the deals of my size. So I really go through the LOI and I sort of do a analysis of what does this actually mean, and what is in the LOI, what actually am I getting, what am I giving up? And I think it's really important to understand the components of whatever that purchase price is.
So to make the final point on this, if you hire a banker as part of your process, you're not going to be receiving any LOIs until the bidders have received the book that the banker prepared about your company, has gone to market, has had conversations, has disclosed the things that Greg was referring to and has informed a group of buyers as best as they can be informed so that when they submit the LOIs, they don't lack an understanding of your business. And then you're comparing apples to apples. Where the LOI becomes problematic in the context of your question is if you receive an unsolicited LOI and you're trying to evaluate the merits of it. They probably don't know enough about your company. Even if you received a couple of unsolicited LOIs, no book has been out in the marketplace describing what is for actual sale. So that's, again, why the process of selling starts well before the LOI.
The closest thing to bad faith you'll find is the unsolicited LOI where they actually don't know enough. They're throwing it out there, trying to get you off the market, and then they're going to peel back all these things once they get a chance to do diligence. Oldest trick in the book. All these things are tactics. You just have to know what those tactics are, know how to address them, and deal with them up front. All of these details exactly needed. I maybe took for granted because I would not issue a bid request letter that didn't have all of the things Janice mentioned. You have to know those things. It's not worth a nickel if you don't know how they're going to do the working capital adjustment. That is a huge problem for owners that don't understand how that's going to work in a deal. It's money that changes hands at the closing, and you better know how that works, and your banker should explain all these things before you even ask people to give you bids.
Then with an LOI, you're locked up for a certain period of time if you've signed that LOI for them to go through their diligence. So once you accept it, you are locked up for whatever period they deem is necessary for the diligence. So
What happens when your biggest competitor sends you an offer letter or calls you and says, I want to buy your business and I'm going to go after it tooth and nail?
Everything about an M&A process is excruciatingly logical at the end of the day if you break it down into its smallest pieces. Every client we work with has certain buyers they would never sell the business to for whatever the price is, and they'll take people off the list. So you don't have to go to people you don't want to. You tailor the process to what you want. You should take that buyer, and if you are interested, you don't answer the call, you don't respond, you tell them you're not interested, you might talk to your advisors, and at the right time, you would have an advisor reach out and start things on your terms. When you're ready to do it, you never share financial information with anybody because you want that to be scrubbed and presented on your terms, again, not what they're going to see. And you'll never get a chance to represent them once they've seen whatever you send them. Oh, I'll send my audits. Bad move, because adjustments to EBITDA for private companies are usually double what your actual profitability is. And if you show them the low number, they're just, you're not going to get them to move up from there. So I think you register that interest. One of the best tricks that I see owners that are really good at this do, they create the anticipation from the buyer universe by making sure they've got a really good marketing effort in terms of making sure the people out there know of them, know who they are, know that employees want to work there, know that customers want to work with them, suppliers want to work with them, but you just give everybody the Heisman. You don't talk to them until it's time for you to talk to them, and you work with your advisors and you get smart about all this stuff, and then you unleash a very specific and tactical program to take advantage of every hole they're going to step in when you've got people that have done this 100 times. So it's super easy to predict how buyers are going to react. If they call you unsolicited, 100% of the time it's because they want to pay you less than they would have to if they were going to compete for the business. 100%. So as it relates to exclusivity periods that might be in an LOI, how do we approach how long you give somebody? And then what's our approach to whether you would ever give a buyer an extension should you run through that period? As I mentioned earlier, you're competing terms as well as price when you ask people to submit their best and final letter of intent. The two-stage process I mentioned earlier, by the way, the first stage, they would deal only with your advisor reviewing the confidential information memorandum or SIM and they submit an IOI or indication of interest that has the high-level terms because they haven't yet met you toward the facility, all that kind of stuff. But an LOI, you're asking for very specific things that you might consider signing and moving forward with that party on. Exclusivity is an important piece of that, and we would expect that you're going to have to grant exclusivity for a period of time that, as Janice said, they're spending 7 figures on diligence to get all their advisors in. So what they're going to ask for is probably, we want to have 180 days, and we'll go back and say, no, you're going to get 45 days. And you might end up at like 60. But you do that behind your curtain with your advisors, knowing that it's hard to get something done in 60 days. And if someone's really working in earnest to get things done on the terms you agreed to, you know, you don't tell them this, but you know you're willing to give them an extension if they're busting it and you're, still 15, 20, 30 days away. However, the reason you want that as short as you can get it is if they're just sitting there and they're not doing anything and you're off the market, no way. You want to pull the plug as fast as you can. If they start trying to change terms in an unfair way, like I mentioned earlier over here, there could be very legitimate reasons why they retrade the deal, and you need to make an assessment. Is that retrade something, when I go back to everybody else, that they also didn't know and they're also likely to retrade on that? So then it's my problem and I got to figure out whether I want to eat that retrade or not, or are they just trying to squeeze me and I'm going to get rid of them and go back to my other bidders? They don't know, by the way, how many bidders you have, where those other bidders were. So sometimes your banker is on a thin ice trying to play a game with some of those people if you don't have that many bidders in the same stratosphere. But you shorten it as short as you can. You're willing to give an extension if people are working hard to get your deal done at those terms. But it's always in your control that way as to whether you eventually do give them. I've had good deals that have gotten done where you've given people a couple of extensions. We just finished one a couple of weeks ago that sadly had to go for like 6 different extensions. You evaluate the term, the reason why it needed an extension, and then you make you want that in your hands, not the buyers, I guess is the point.
I'm also going to mention, though, from a seller's perspective, this goes back to why you need to be ready. Because if you've ever looked at a due diligence checklist, they are extensive. And you need to be ready, because if the buyer comes in and you negotiate 60 days, you better be able to provide everything on their list for 60 days. I often see sellers asking for extensions. And, that puts you in a less... you really don't want to slow down momentum. You don't want to give the buyer any reason to slow down. I'm also just going to comment a little bit on the industry. There are some industries that need, certain approvals and whatever that will extend that date. But, you also think about it from a seller's perspective. You want to be ready if you're going to try to shorten that date.
Great point. It actually is almost never all on the buyer, because it takes forever to get this stuff. Even when you're prepared, you got to constantly put stuff together. And the regulatory environment, if it's a big enough deal, you've got to go through Hart-Scott-Rodino. If it's international, maybe it's CFIUS. I mean, there's a whole host of things that are out of your control as to how long the government in various reasons get to approve it. But usually the exclusivity period is until you can sign a purchase agreement. And once you've signed the purchase agreement, then you're under a different set of rules that typically that extended period of time for approval would work. But you try to keep as much as you can in your control so you can always make the decision you think is right as an owner.
Well, I want to thank our panel for doing just a fantastic job. Really, everybody I thought did an amazing job. I want to thank Penta Wealth Management's Director of Client Service and Operations, Anthony Lima, for just doing a great job with preparing a lot of the logistics and event planning for tonight. As I'm thinking about a lot of the questions that were raised here, most of what we talked about tonight, there are articles and white papers in the event resources page that is accessible via the QR code in your packets. We were pretty careful about what to put on that resources page. So most of the topics we covered, there are articles and white papers about all of that that you can, that you have access to. You can read about it, learn more. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. It was a great event, and hopefully everybody got a lot out of it. If anybody has any questions afterwards, we're available. Feel free to get in touch. And thanks everybody for coming.